Okay, thank you all for coming today to this year's Conversations Across Disciplines. My name is Irene Routté, and I, along with Anna Wood, have co-organized this event. And we just have a lot of gratitude for each of you coming out, both here in person and online. And just being here at a time where things feel really volatile, uneasy. There's just a lot going on around us. So just being here for this important conversation around abolition and institutional and systematic change. We want to express our gratitude to the generosity of those who helped make this event happen. So thank you so much to the Office of the Dean of Social Work and the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion program for support through their Social Justice Impact Fund. And we're also deeply grateful to the Veroff Endowed Fund, which made this gathering possible. The Veroff Fund was established with gifts from the School of Social Work faculty members, Professor Chidia, Professor Glover Reed, and Professor Ingersoll Dayton, along with gifts from family and friends in honor of 2 respected and loved scholars and mentors. The Endowed Fund provides support annually for this event, Conversations Across Social Disciplines, which represents the important values and principles embodied by both Joseph Veroff and Katherine Pavelka Luke. We also feel incredibly honored. Well, actually, they're not here, but they're supposed to be here, and I think they'll trickle in, but her daughter and her widower are coming to the event as well. So we just feel honored that they want to be here and support the ongoing vision of Katherine. This event emerged from a year-long workshop series that Anna and I started through Rackham interdisciplinary workshops that focused on how, as student practitioners and student activists, we incorporate theories and politics of abolitionist and anti-carceral thought into our ongoing research and action. So today we'll hear from 3 abolitionist scholars coming from fields of social work and education who apply abolitionist frameworks to their work on system and institutional change in higher education, banking, and financial systems, and the US child welfare system. Our conversation will focus on questions such as why abolition? How do we ensure safety and well-being that does not rely on carceral practices? And what are tactics and strategies for institutional and systematic change that allow us to build more liberating structures and futures? And we'll also have time for both in-person and online questions. So when we come to that part, and those who are joining online, if you want to drop questions into the chat, we'll get those and share them out. So without further ado, I'll pass it off to Anna, who will be facilitating our discussion.
Thank you so much, Irene. Super excited about this. It's been a long planning journey, and now we're here. So thank you all for being in this space with us. I thought that we might just start out by having each of our panelists give a short introduction of yourselves, explain your role in the Academy, and the focus of your work. So Terri, if you want to start us off.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that, and we're going to co-opt that first question a little bit with a statement that we want to make as panelists, and so we'll do that, and then maybe can return to the question that Anna asked. So we want to begin by acknowledging the ongoing genocide in Palestine and the connections between abolition and the imperative of a free Palestine. And we think starting our conversation here is really important. The connections are really important because Israel has been killing and starving Palestinians acutely for the last 6 months, in addition to violence of the decades-long Israeli occupation and threatening to incite a broader war in the Middle East. And many abolitionists and revolutionary leaders have been clear on solidarity with Palestine. And one of the very first statements that the Black Panther Party released in 1970 stated, "We support the Palestinians' just struggle for liberation 100%. We will go on doing this, and we would like for all of the progressive people of the world to join our ranks in order to make a world in which all people can live.
Following his release from prison in South Africa in 1997, Nelson Mandela said, "We know too well that our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of Palestinians." This connection is also key to the University of Michigan, like other institutions, which passed resolutions condemning South African apartheid in the 1990s and have since dishonored that commitment in the present. In a 2014 interview, activist and scholar Angela Davis linked global revolutionary struggles, saying that just as the struggle to end South African apartheid was embraced by people all over the world and was incorporated into many social justice agendas, solidarity with Palestine must likewise be taken up by organizations and movements involved in progressive causes all over the world. This is precisely the moment to encourage everyone who believes in equality and justice to join the call for a free Palestine.
And then just last year, released in 2023, abolitionist organizers Kelly Hayes and Mariam Kaba wrote in their book, Let This Radicalize You, saying the repression of Palestinian resistance offers a profound example of the elasticity of violence as a concept and shows how, while the powerful can wage war on particular communities with impunity and claim innocence, the oppressed can be deemed a violent threat simply for attempting to assert their rights or defend their humanity. So today we're going to talk about how we came to abolition and how abolitionist praxis is part of our academic work as well as our everyday lives. But we wanted to be clear at the outset as we move into a conversation about family policing, cops on campus, and carceral capitalism, that solidarity with Palestinians, as is solidarity with all oppressed peoples, is central to each of our praxis. And again, to echo the call that Angela Davis gave a decade ago, this is precisely the moment to encourage everyone who believes in equality and justice to join the call for a free Palestine.
And maybe you can repeat that question that you asked, Anna.
Gladly, yes. Go ahead and give a short introduction to yourselves. Tell us a little about your work and your role in the Academy.
My name is Terri Friedline. I use she and her pronouns. I'm a faculty member here in the School of Social Work, and I study banking and finance, financial inclusion in the context of racial capitalism. And that's all I'll say for now.
Hi everyone, I'm Alan Detlaff. I'm a professor at the University of Houston Graduate College of Social Work and one of the co-founders of the Up In movement, which is a movement focused on abolition of the child welfare system, which many of us refer to, which we think more accurately as the family policing system, because of the roles of surveillance, regulation, and punishment that that system plays in families' lives. So my work focuses on studying the broader abolitionist movement over time, how that applies to the family policing system, but also building solidarity between abolition movements with the idea that what I believe and what many people believe, there's really just one abolition movement in the United States. We approach it from different aspects, but there's one abolition movement that focuses on liberation of all people.
I'm Charles Davis. I'm an assistant professor in the Center for the Study of Higher and Post-Secondary Education right across the breezeway here, a less nicer school than this, which seems to be the case with schools of education always. I also direct what we're calling the Campus Abolition Research Lab. I'm thankful to be joined by a number of our research associates here, and our primary aim is to think about reimagining higher education as a life-affirming institution.
Thank you all so much. So let's just start out. Can you tell us all about what brought you to abolitionist praxis? And perhaps you can also get into a discussion of what we all mean by praxis today and how that differs from beliefs or politics.
Sure, I'll start. So the short answer, do you have a little echo? The short answer to that is a Facebook comment, because we love those, don't we? But actually from a colleague, friend, and comrade, Aisha Lewis McCoy, who's a former public defender and now works in other sectors. And I had posted something that we have a little, is it that one? Checking, 1, 2, 3, no, we're good, yes? Maybe it's the frequency of my voice.
Echoing.
Sound is also confused. Can we take a little mic break or just put it further away? Echo. Yeah? Oh. All right. I always blame the feds when these types of things happen. But there was a Facebook comment from my homegirl, and I had posted, I think, something, it might have actually been about R. Kelly at the time. This was many years ago. And I said something effective like, oh, bury him under the jail, which is a common, like, black colloquial saying for bad things for bad people. And she was like, oh, I thought you to be an abolitionist. I'm like, girl, I don't believe in slavery. What do you mean? She was like, oh, well, you know, boom, 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 boom. So she starts like kind of engaging with me, this connective tissue between sort of the abolition institution of slavery and us thinking about these, you know, carceral imaginations, and how even those who are perpetrators of sexual violence, right, when we think about the context of that in the carceral imagination, what prison actually does and does not do and doesn't afford to survivors and victims of sexual violence. And so that got me on a different sort of way of thinking about my relationship to carcerality. But I would say more broadly, me engaging with abolitionism really came through the form of organizing. There was very little that I learned formally in the academy about abolition beyond sort of the context of the abolition of chattel slavery. And it was organizers through my political homes with Dream Defenders down in Florida, Black Lives Matter Los Angeles, Black and Brown Workers Collective in Philly, a number of other places, and deep political study that had me sort of seek out then less about specific institutions, but this broader way of understanding of how do we deal with issues of harm and violence, how do we deal with issues of accountability, and what does that mean not just in the context of my sort of political commitments, but actually my relations. And in all the ways, as someone who is the firstborn son of an Army colonel, son of a school teacher, grandson of a librarian, all of whom are learned individuals, had to then also think about, from an educational standpoint, right, where do we think about harm and violence occurring in educational contexts and spaces? And broadly, what brought me to sort of my current iteration of my agenda was thinking of how do we trouble this notion that higher education is a solution for society's problems, right? There is this framing that we think of higher education as what we call the domain of solutions and society as the domain of problems, when in actuality we know to be true that higher education, perhaps even more than any other institution, is deeply complicit and participatory in the structural disadvantages that happen in society. And this is very antithetical to like the study of higher education. That's not what we think about and try to do in education more specifically. But I had been politically oriented in a way that said I need to ask different questions than my colleagues of these particular places. I need to also ask how I benefit, right? And I had certainly seen as a frontline organizer, but also in strategy spaces, the role of policing in, you know, punishing student protesters, you know, stifling political dissent, all of which are things, of course, at the University of Michigan we are well aware of now, but has also been very, very prominent in the study of student activism more broadly. And so that then really had me contend with this idea of praxis, right? Probably one of the most famous philosophers of praxis is our dear brother Chairman Fred Hampton, who said theory's cool, but theory without practice ain't shit. And I was like, you're right, Fred, it's not, right? And so then I had to start asking myself of if I find myself or believe myself to be an abolitionist, as Aisha sort of raised, what does that mean for my relationship with racial capitalism in the context of the university? What does it mean for my relationship with my graduate students with whom I have the opportunity and pleasure to work with? What are the conditions within which I'm expecting them to live, work, and learn that are deeply toxic and harmful and violent, things that tradition would say you should have to deal with because I did, because that's just a rite of passage? What does it mean about my relationship with time? What does it mean about my relationship more broadly with people in a place that overwhelmingly prioritizes productivity, prestige, and profit over them? And so this has now become this sort of ongoing struggle where I think, as you know, some scholars have articulated, that to be an abolitionist is less of an identity, right? And in part because the identity itself becomes fallible. But what does it mean to make a consistent and ongoing political commitment to think about different relationships between harm, violence, and accountability, to not think of punishment as the primary form of accountability, right? To think beyond the idea of retribution and to imagine what restoration, what transformation possibly looks like.
So I came to abolition in a really roundabout way, in the sense that I went into social work in the mid 1990s, really, because I wanted to work for Child Protective Services. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do as a career at that point in my life. I knew I wanted to do something that involved helping with children and families, but didn't know what that really looked like. One night I saw a news story about a reporter who went on a ride-along with a child protective services worker. And I thought, wow, that's the kind of work that I want to do. I could really make a difference. I could really help people. And I changed my major to social work because of that. I did my undergraduate internship with Child Protective Services in Fort Worth, Texas. And then I worked for that agency for many years. And for all of the years when I was in that agency, I really believed that I was helping people. I believed that I was rescuing children from harm. I think of it now as a serious process of indoctrination and brainwashing that people who work for that system go through, where we come to believe that parents are bad, children are in need of saving or rescuing, and the way to rescue them is to take them away and to put them in a better environment. It wasn't until years after I left the agency that I really started to think about my complicity in harming hundreds of children and families. I started to get involved in reform efforts with the state that were focusing on reducing what the state calls racial disproportionality, or the overrepresentation of Black children in the system. And I was able to look back on my time in the system and realize that not only were most of the children that I forcibly took away from their parents Black and brown children, but also they really didn't need to be forcibly separated. There were other things that could have been done to address the issues that were happening in these families. And I always remember thinking that not once of all of the children that I took away from their parents did any of those children ever say to me, "Thank you so much for taking me away from my horrible, abusive parents." That never happened. And in fact, when I would go to visit those children afterwards, all they wanted to know is when they were going to go back home, and I would have no answers for them. So coming to terms with my complicity and harm, and I think about that often. I think I can remember the children I removed. I can remember the moms who would grab their babies and lock themselves in a bathroom to keep me and the cops that I brought with me to take their children away. And that harm really haunts me to this day, because there's absolutely no accountability process for people who have caused that kind of harm. So thinking about my own complicity and then the reform efforts that I was involved in, at a certain point I realized that they were doing nothing. And you kind of realize after a while, and many of you probably experienced this in your careers, where you realize you're having the same conversations over and over for literally decades at this point, and nothing changes. And I still didn't really have the language of abolition, but I had the opportunity when I was dean of the College of Social Work at University of Houston to invite Angela Davis in 2018 to speak to us at that point about police violence and the role of social workers in addressing police violence. And that was the first time I heard about abolition. And I read her books, read other people's books, and really saw the connections between abolition of the prison industrial complex and abolition of the child welfare system. And that became the work that I do since then. I think the way that I think about it in terms of my relation to the institutions now, for me, I struggle a lot to think for myself, what do I think social work is? And I think all of you who are social workers need to kind of think about what social work is. And I think we need to untrain ourselves from what we've come to believe social work is and the history of social work, because the reality of social work is that social work is an incredibly carceral profession that started back in the days of Jane Addams as a means of social control and behavior modification, and that's the way that social work is practiced today. So for me, I think of social work, the origins of social work in the Black Panther Party movement, and providing free food to people and providing what people really need and care for people that is not conditional on going to some class or receiving some service or being punished in some way or feeling that you need to be punished before you can receive access to this service. And then I also think a lot about my role as an abolitionist in institutions of higher education, which has been really difficult for me over the past few years. And a PhD student that I work with actually wrote a brilliant article in a journal, the Abolitionist Perspectives in Social Work, which is a journal that I co-founded a couple of years ago. But the article talks about the concept of fugitivity And that as an abolitionist in an institution that is built on a foundation of white supremacy, built for the purpose of maintaining white people in power and still operates in ways to keep white people in power, to think of ourselves as fugitives. Because when we think of ourselves as fugitives, then there's no expectation of any kind of reward from the system, because why would we want to be rewarded or acknowledged by a harmful racist institution? It also gives the freedom to break the rules because you're a fugitive already. And that's just expected of you. So that's for me the way that I've come to think of myself as an abolitionist in this space, really to keep some of my sanity and stay in this kind of institution. So that's how it's worked for me.
Well, earlier today we were talking about moments of politicization and radicalization, and so there are a couple different ones for me that I trace different lines of opportunities to become an abolitionist that have built up over time. And I think for me, constantly across my life, I am going to be working to narrow the gap between what it is I believe and value and what are my practices in everyday life. So that sort of praxis of theory that I see as an ongoing sort of lifelong process. But one of those points of radicalization for me was in 2003 when Rachel Corrie was killed by the Israeli forces as she was, standing in front of a bulldozer to protect the destruction of Palestinian homes. And I say this not to provide some sort of revisionist history of what I have done since then around Palestinian liberation, but to say that in 2003, I didn't have a personal computer or a cell phone, but somehow this event was really impactful for me. Rachel Corrie was another, white woman from the U.S. who was doing international kind of peace activism. I had just spent nearly a year in Ecuador post September 11th, having a different sort of international experience for myself, and being a part of or observing protests that were happening in Ecuador at the time. And so I was considering work and volunteering as an international peace activist, and looking to work for different organizations around the world doing similar sort of work. So that was really alarming and politicizing for me to know that struggles for freedom were kind of stretching around the globe in all of these different sorts of ways, and that internationalism is very much connected to abolitionist principles, knowing that struggles are connected and that we are in solidarity internationally. About a decade after that, Trayvon Martin was murdered and his killer was acquitted. And so that was a time when I began more seriously to dedicate myself to study and organizing. And I began reading Angela Davis and Malcolm X and James Baldwin, many who also write about abolition and or about Palestine in their work. And that's probably when I can trace kind of more acutely being interested in and aligning with abolitionist principles. I also was raised in a peace and nonviolence tradition where anti-death penalty work was very much a kind of thread of my growing up. So that felt very consistent then with thinking about abolition. And what I do now around banking and finance and racial capitalism, I mean, so much of the financial system has underwritten violence of all sorts across history. So there's been, the financial system developed in the context of chattel slavery and transatlantic slavery. Those systems could not exist in their form without, kind of unified, connected, systematic financial systems that could, make money apparent for people who are benefiting from those systems to accumulate wealth. And so, so that's how I think about abolition as connected to finance and how the ways finance kind of underwrite not just the building of prisons and jails, but also the accumulation of capital and wealth and harm in other contexts.
Thanks so much. And I think I want to come back to this this idea of praxis to try and establish for the duration of the panel, because it's in the title of the panel, and I often find praxis to be a little bit of, it's one of those slightly alienating words. I think it's a great word, but it's a very academic, sort of alienating word, and I don't know that it's often clear what anyone is actually talking about. And then we make it worse by saying, oh, it's when you do theory with, and then everyone's like, ah. And so I love that you brought up fugitivity, Alan, and I was thinking about in our conversation yesterday, in one of our conversations yesterday, folks were talking about the idea of academic insurgency, which it was sort of connecting those things. And I wonder how these ideas of academic or intellectual fugitivity and insurgency are connected to how you guys understand your praxis as intellectuals and as academics doing your work.
Are we doing the polite panel thing?
Yeah.
I think we have to say stuff, I think. So I'll jump back in again. I think this is a really great question, and Alan, I so much appreciated that framing of like fugitivity. I talk about this a lot like in the classroom, and the sort of obligation we have not to refuse our position as fugitive within the academy, because there were so many like literal and material fugitives that made possible our existence to be in this space to begin with, right? And we were talking at the beginning about like, you know, hey, we're gonna do this statement, like we understand that you're junior, and I was like, that's probably what I should have referenced initially, like I'm already fugitive here, so it's not gonna do anything beyond what I've already done to myself with regard to like the future possibilities of me gaining tenure. And I think so much about teaching and learning in the Black radical tradition, and even through the institution and the emancipation of slavery, that like all learning and teaching by Black people was considered fugitive, right? And to like hold a space as a classroom. I'm a firm believer that every moment is teachable and any space can become a classroom, right? That was like an insurgent act. I think about the lessons that we learn from people that we don't think have any education, right? I think about my great-grandmother who raised 15 children in a one-room shack in Wetumpka, Alabama. And I think about her as that constant reminder in all of these rooms of like, okay, baby, like what you gonna do? Which version of yourself are you gonna show up as? Because the person to whom I'm answerable, right, if you think about answerability as something different from accountability, the community to whom I'm answerable, all of them are fugitives, right? All of them had to engage in insurgency to make possible my participation in this system. So it's actually, in many regards, for me, a deep betrayal to not stand in that tradition, right? And I think I see so many other academics who have like made it to a certain point, right? To be the first or the only, and celebrate that, right? Celebrate that exceptionalism, that individualism that has been rewarded, and no longer think or understand themselves to be fugitive, although the university can and will remind us at a moment's notice that you are fugitive here, right? That they will discard and displace and disabuse us of our responsibilities. And so for me, having been in certain ecosystems, worked with certain people, seeing how those things have been accumulated, right, individually and amassed at the expense of folks who have been more vulnerable to harm and violence, I don't want to betray that legacy, right? Because I know at the end of the day that yes, there is the white man on my shoulder saying do X, Y, and Z, right? But like he ain't got a chance against my grandma Hattie. And when I leave, that white man stays here at the university, and I got to go talk to these other folks, right, who are going to ask me not just how my day went, right, but like how do I feel, right? Am I okay? Do I feel cared for? And I think for me, I wouldn't know any other way to move, because there's a certain sense of like unsettledness that I've always felt of moving in accordance with like the institution. And I had to learn the hard way, to be sure, right? I had to learn some very tough lessons throughout my career, still learning lessons now, about all the ways the university will disabuse you of your position at a moment's notice, that make clear that I'm serving a thing that does not serve me and does not serve my people, and actually has spent more time socializing me and us out of community with our people, right? If I identify as a third-generation educator committed to the lives, love, and liberation of everyday Black people, and I don't have no relationship with everyday Black people, right? that I feel estranged going into communities that I should feel a part of, or I demonstrate something that is a signal to other Black people, like, you don't want to trust this one, right? That means that what we've been fighting for is all for nothing. And I don't know that there's a place of peace if I'm actually seeking out peace, which I think many of us are. I could like live with myself in a way that said I've done everything to and for this particular place that has done very little for me and cares very little about me if and whenever it is my time to leave. They will replace me with someone else who can get them the things that they would like. If the political climate starts to shift and turn, which it has, right? We've all seen this in the wake of just even the time I've been here from 2020 to now, right? Rah, 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 anti-racism. Let's revamp and reimagine campus and community safety. Oh shit, Palestine. Just kidding. We're not trying to do any of those things, right? Humanization is not important. Recognition of dignity is not important. And so again, I could have gotten lost in the sauce and thought it was about me wherever I thought I brought in this sort of post-George Floyd moment. And many of our scholar friends did this, right? Opposed to knowing like, no, I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop, right? And inevitably, it's always going to be some aspect of what's happening geopolitically in our interests. So yeah, I feel like, you know, it's an obligation of us to commit to a life of fugitivity and insurgency because, and I sort of say this often, if we actually win, right, if we achieve the things we say that we achieve, if these places literally and or figuratively burn down, if we have not committed to that lifestyle, we will have no place to call home and no one to call our neighbor. And that's not the life that I want to live.
I really do think I concur with all of that in the sense that to me, praxis really is about embracing that concept of fugitivity in the sense that it means constantly challenging the status quo that we're fed, usually by the white people who control the sources of information that we get, and constantly challenging that. As Assata Shakur says, no one is going to give you the education you need to overthrow them. So you have to educate yourself about those things. And I think it comes with ability to, or a recognition that at some point you have to act in a way that demonstrates integrity with your principles without fear of consequences. And I didn't realize this when I became dean, but at some point I realized that, you know, a few years into my deanship, I was hired as dean in 2015. At a few years into that, I realized I was the first Mexican-American dean to be hired at the University of Houston. I was the first openly gay person to be hired at the University of Houston as dean. And those kind of positions weren't created for me. And I realized that I had that position of power because a white person chose to give me that position. And there were expectations of me that came with being given that position. And that meant falling in line with the institution and what the institution wanted me to say and wanted me to represent. And for many years, I did that. I made decisions that were, or I took actions that were against what I felt was the right thing because my boss, the provost, told me I needed to protect the school or protect the university. And because of different things that happened in my evolution while I was dean, my ideas about that changed, where I realized that, yes, I have this position because a white person chose to give me this position. And at any given moment, I could do something or say something that that white person doesn't like, and then that white person will take it away from me. And I got to a place where I was okay with that, and that's exactly what happened. It was a different white person that fired me from the dean role than the one that hired me, but that's what happened. And I was okay with that. And I think that's what being a fugitive is about. I mean, obviously I want to preface that, like the privilege of tenure is enormous, that a lot of people who are in other positions don't have, and I had that. But to me, it really is about constantly challenging. I'll give you another quick example in terms of why it's so important to embrace that concept of fugitivity. In 2020, I wrote an op-ed when there was a lot of narrative about how social workers needed to collaborate with the police, and that was the solution to police violence if we just had more social workers. And I really disagreed with that, and I wrote an op-ed in the Houston Chronicle, which is not like National Exposure, it's not like the New York Times or anything, Houston Chronicle, about how that was just not the solution, that social workers were not the solution to racism because social workers have their own problems with racism, and just putting social workers in places doesn't mean you're not going to have racist outcomes. And just to show you that, like, the backlash of that kind of conversation, the president then of the Council on Social Work Education called me on the phone and yelled at me for publishing that and said, yes, those are conversations we need to have, but those are conversations we need to have behind closed doors. You don't have those kind of conversations in public. And that, to me, showed me just how there was this huge mechanism that tried to block any kind of accountability for the profession with this behind closed doors idea. And that if I and others are not continuing to say these things out loud and in public for others to hear, there's never going to be accountability. There's never going to be any reckoning in this profession. And we have to continue doing that. That's praxis to me.
And behind closed doors is, right? So nobody can know. Yeah, I
Can check if you do anything about it.
Yeah. I appreciate both of your remarks because I was thinking about, how does the concept of fugitivity connect to my praxis, my area of work? And I think questions like, who am I in solidarity with? And how am I showing up with integrity, I think, are like both things that I relate to from what you have said. And so for the fugitivity piece and related to some of my work, I suppose I'll give an anecdote, is that, studying banking and finance and social work, a lot of, research on like wealth and money is financed and funded, right, by banks and insurance companies. It's like very common and typical. And I was working on this project with a community partner, doing something that I, would generally like provide accolades, right, in the academic setting. You have a community partner, it's collaborative. The project I thought was going to be useful and really important, just focused on a particular thing. We worked on it maybe for 2 years or so. We developed the research plan together. We put the ideas into a cohesive proposal. The community partner went out and, we were now looking for funding, and they came back and said, we think we have a funder who's gonna, really generously fund this project, and it's really exciting. We think there might be a little hiccup. This is hilarious to me a little bit, so might not be as hilarious to you if you don't know all of the backstory, but the funder was Wells Fargo, and I had written a piece like maybe a couple weeks earlier, a year earlier, about the closing of Wells Fargo and like using like abolitionist lens and like futurist thinking to imagine our financial institutions that are harmful. And how we might dismantle them. There's actually like a standard operating procedure manual for like closing down banks. It's something that happens routinely. There's like a way to go about doing that if we want to dismantle something and build another, a different sort of vision. We have models for that. And so I wrote this sort of like creative piece of writing about closing down Wells Fargo, who then is coming along and wants to fund this community project, which would have been great in terms of grant funding, right? It could have had course buyouts and research support and another line to say something on the CV, and that was like, it was a project that I had like developed and spent a lot of time developing, but was not something that was going to help me be in solidarity with the people that I cared about being in solidarity with to accept that project. So, right, that moved on without me. And, Wells Fargo continued to fund the project, and it's, work done by other people. I don't feel any sort of like, stress or frustration about that because that was a decision I felt that I was making, like very aligned with the values that I had, and felt like solid in that decision. But maybe as an example of that, like kind of fugitive or an insurgent, or at least like practicing in alignment with the things that I care about, and that others then I would hope would see that as consistent, right? To otherwise accept that funding would be, right, then untrustworthy, I would think, with the people and the places that I'm like building a relationship with.
Thank you all so much. I want to shift the conversation to the institutional change, or starting with institutions, part of this panel conversation. Each of you sort of focuses your work on fugitivity and insurgency into existing institutions that have significant presence in all of our lives in different ways. And so can you talk through the carceral practices that you see in those institutions? And also, I'm combining my two questions on this one. Talk about the assumptions that those practices are there for safety, or that they're coming from a benevolent place. So this is what institutions tend to do. They control and surveil and punish in the name of safety or benevolence or something like that. So let's talk about the institutions in which each of you critique.
All right, I'll go ahead and start thinking about banking and finance. So banks and lenders and insurance companies, right, they were stood up in the mid-1800s. There's not, so banks today exist very differently than they did at the time of chattel slavery and transatlantic slavery. So they're different institutions, but despite that, not any time in the history of their existence have they ever delivered anything like fair, equal, just access to credit or financial products and services. Not any time, and measured in centuries. And so there's both change, and that they're like different institutions. They're larger, they hold more money, there's less transparency in how they operate. They wield more political power, much have, exacerbated kind of like elite wealth accumulation. And they're very durable and very consistent, and that they have consistently financed harm and violence in a lot of different ways. So they've like consistently financed, the upholding of enslaved bodies as wealth for white slave owners. They've consistently upheld segregation and redlining. And today we still have unequal access to credit and, harmful predatory credit, expensive credit. And so sort of their consistency and their change is happening at the same time in ways that both align with, white supremacy and anti-Blackness in particular ways. And so, can you say your part of your question again, Anna? How?
Yeah. So the next part of the question being that these institutions often
are benevolent.
Yeah, they present themselves as benevolent, or the exact practices that we may call carceral or racist or harmful may be the same ones that they are holding up as in the name of benevolence or social good.
Yeah, and we have, really poignant examples from the financial system in the last couple of years, making, big commitments to racial justice, investing somehow in racial justice, which includes lending, sometimes even at higher cost rates, gives the appearance of benevolence, yet still functions as this like exploitative and predatory sort of mechanism. I think there are a lot of connections to the ways that this happens in social work, because social work sometimes is interested in practices of financial inclusion and credit building, which are very practical things that people have to deal with in the context of racial capitalism, right? How do we sort of navigate, survive, make decisions in this sort of everyday system that is, harmful, and we're trying to like pay rent and put food on our plates and need a credit score that's going to show up for a landlord things such as this. And so a lot of our interventions that focus on financial inclusion, credit building, these tend to be, presented benevolently as if we're helping, yet oftentimes like visibilize people so that they can be now recorded, surveilled for exploitation by these systems. Now we have noticed you and added you to our system to be able to offer you this particular sort of credit product. Tamara Knopper, as a sociologist, has done a lot of writing about credit scoring and digital character and surveillance in the credit system in particular. And so I think, that's one thing to consider about the interventions that we're doing is like we're often intervening for individuals, but it's like systems and structures that we need to reshape and remodel and shift because that benevolence is it's a facade. It like facilitates the harm that happens in the system in other ways.
So really similarly to that, the child welfare system has avoided a lot of critique over the years and avoided being considered part of the broader carceral state and an abolitionist movement because of this myth of benevolence that it has done a very good job perpetuating really for decades. I think most people in society who are not very familiar with the system think that the system protects children from harm, protects children from horribly abusive parents that need to be rescued from those parents, when in reality that's not what the system is doing at all. Most people don't realize that over 70% of children in foster care right now are in foster care because of what the state calls neglect, which is largely associated with poverty. Less than 15% of children in foster care today are in foster care because of physical or sexual abuse. So the system is not protecting children from harm. The system is taking children away from their parents because they're poor. And what that really demonstrates is the carceral logic that the system operates under, which is a logic that says that when people are poor and when people are experiencing challenges because of their poverty, it's because of their own individual pathology. It's because of decisions that they made that have then led to them making bad parenting decisions, not being able to care for their children in the way that they should have because they're poor. And that poverty is a result of their decisions, while avoiding an entire understanding of the societal structural factors that put people in poverty and maintain people in poverty. And the reason the system, not just that system, but other systems use that logic is because it distracts us from thinking about why poverty exists and how poverty is really maintained. Because if we believe that it's parents' fault for being in poverty and it's their fault that they're not able to meet their children's needs, then we're not thinking about the fault of the government in keeping people in poverty. Because the reality is the government knows exactly how to solve poverty, has all of the resources that it needs to do so, and intentionally chooses not to. In case you all don't, I'll give a quick example. Just like last year, information came out about the child tax credit that had been extended during COVID, and it was a 1-year extension. And when that tax credit was extended, child poverty went down from about 10% in the US to 5%. When that tax credit, when that waiver was ended last year, child poverty, or in 2022, child poverty went back up to 12%. So child poverty today is higher than it was pre-COVID. But what that shows is that the government knows exactly how to solve poverty and has done it before. And there were no negative repercussions for that. And they chose to take that away. So if there's anything to understand about the economy, where money comes from, it's entirely made up. There's no such thing as the economy. There's no such thing as money. It doesn't exist. When the government wants more money, they just make more money. Think of the trillions of dollars that were spent on COVID relief. That money wasn't budgeted by the government. Nobody knew that COVID was going to happen. but it materialized. Think of the billions of dollars that are being sent today to Israel to fund a genocide. That money wasn't budgeted. Well, actually, that money to fund Israel has been budgeted for decades. But we're giving more and more money to Israel today. When the government wants money there, it turns up. But we don't think about that because we're blaming parents. We're going around taking kids away from their parents because they're poor, and we're blaming it on them.
I'm very thankful for the things that both of you all shared. My mind is like somewhere else right now, thinking about all the different pieces and the connections here. And so when I think about this in the context of higher education, there's a few things that come to mind. So I've been thinking about higher education's relationship to carcerality. There's this sort of like idea of what they've called the carceral university, and it's rather underspecified in the literature. It's kind of been reduced to this idea that, universities have increased their capacity to police and punish. And we know that vis-a-vis, campus policing apparatuses, which have basically the same authoritative powers, but less accountability. The municipal police departments are able to enact in some of those very same things. We know the majority of their patrolling patterns, for instance, are actually not in the city limits of campus, but in the sort of perimeter areas that are what I would call sort of the campus borderlands, right? They're enforcing these spatial, physical boundaries between not just the campus and the community of which it's supposed to be a part, but thinks of itself separate, but the us and them dynamic. And so not only does that sort of reinforce this primacy on like the university as the space of solutions, but then it also subjects us to victimization because we are presumed to be outsiders, right? And maybe not today in this particular outfit and this particular diction, but on any given day, we can all be subject to unreasonable search and seizure on the account of assuming that we're not supposed to belong here, right? They have this idea of always needing to have that second ID, that university ID that verifies like your relationship to the institution. And that will still even come into question in many instances. So I say all of that in part is to be thinking about the carceral university as a set of relationships and practices through a series of what I call the carceral entanglements. And there are a number of these, but for brevity, I'll talk about a few of them. So obviously we have the campus policing apparatus, which is most clear. And to be sure, that apparatus functions in a way that isn't just about the us and them dynamic, but the recriminalization and re-victimization of folks who have been subject to being affected by various systems, right? We can think about those who are systems impacted students or formerly incarcerated students who actually cannot come into contact with law enforcement because someone doesn't think you're supposed to be where you actually are, and you come into contact with law enforcement, you violate your parole or probation, and now you're sort of re-subject to being incarcerated. So that's sort of the obvious one. The lesser obvious ones might look at university and sponsored research projects, which have long-standing relationships with carceral institutions in using incarcerated people basically as test animals, right? Not to put a sort of primacy on people over animals. I live in a different world now where I understand that all life is something that should be appreciated and respected, but that we know geneticists and dermatologists specifically have been testing chemical-based products for many of the cosmetics that many folks use on folks who have been incarcerated for many numbers of years. The Homebook prison experiments are noteworthy and has been a long contestation for abolitionists working in Philadelphia, specifically at the University of Pennsylvania. So that's another sort of carceral entanglement of how we utilize those who are already vulnerable to harm and violence to enact more harm and violence. A third version of this, which DeVarian Baldwin explores beautifully in his book, In the Shadow of the Ivory Tower, are the role of university expansion and urban renewal projects. And why this is important is not just in the sort of settler colonial accumulation of resources, right? The siphoning from the public, things that become privatized vis-a-vis the university. But that when we talk about campus policing, we often don't think about all the ways that this university has created the conditions that necessitate policing in the first place, right? This is especially true in your high urban centers, Black and brown neighborhoods, and the expansion of those places, right? I mean, even right? We have places in Detroit that we should be raising questions of why we have these places in Detroit, right? We're laying claims and planting flags on schools, right? For kids that are never gonna be able to come to this institution, right? For what? To be able to point and say that we've done this particular good thing. And so we do that, and then we create these different types of racial and carceral geographies as a consequence of the settler accumulation of the university, right? The University of Pennsylvania Police Department need not be the largest private police force in the state of Pennsylvania other than to ensure that white people and white property are protected from what has been historically known as the black bottom, right? That it had been raised through the establishment of a West Philadelphia corporation of which it was the head to ensure that it could destruct over 600 institutions that were central to black life in West Philly. It renamed itself University City, right? that the last affordable housing site, the Philadelphia University Townhomes, the People's Townhomes as it was known, has recently just gotten bulldozed after 3 years of like avid fighting by people that lived in that intergenerationally, that community, in large part because the university found itself not to consider it a political actor. It could do nothing, despite, again, creating the conditions that raised multi-million-dollar facilities for student housing, right? Established a relationship with the school that it later would just take over and be the place where faculty's students would go, or faculty's children would go get educated. And all of a sudden, you have no responsibility or culpability, right, for these folks getting evicted, generations of people that can no longer live in this place that is arguably the last affordable housing site. So I think about then these types of relationships and entanglements, right, where the university may not see itself formally engaged in these things, and yet it still is. And so when I think about then that in the context of abolition for higher ed, there's always this conversation of like abolition of higher ed or abolition within higher ed. To be sure, I think it's both projects, right? But I think about that in the sense that abolition, if we think about it as the presence, right, not absences, Ruthie Gilmore talks about, that it's the abolition of a higher education system, right, that could police people in its local community. It's the abolition of an institution that could acquire immense amounts of resources, right? It's the abolition of a Harvard University that could buy up land and water rights in a place that it doesn't even exist, right? It's the abolition of a place that could do more harm than it has done actual good. And so then what are the conditions we need to think about that would alter that type of relationship, that would really think about higher education as an enterprise, maybe less individual colleges and universities, but it's that also. Because when I think about life affirmation, there are post-secondary places that provide life-affirming resources and supports, but most of them are the quote-unquote lesser places. It's our open access institutions, our two-year colleges, our vocational, right, and training institutions that do more for life affirmation of everyday people than a place like the University of Michigan could ever do. So I think then it makes us challenge this idea of what prestige's value is, right? Like what is the value of the Block M and the Ann Arbor specifically, when it says that we are gonna double and triple down, right, on our support of our allegiance to Israeli universities, to our investments in the companies that are supporting the Israeli apartheid regime, despite having a campus in Dearborn and in a state that's the most populous of Muslim Arabs and Palestinians in the entire country, right? That like this is the contradiction that has been exposed and the university has not had anything to say or do for it because it finds itself to be, again, part of a solution instead of the progenitor of the problem.
Thank you all so much. This is just, I'm finding myself just sort of getting lost in each of you as you're speaking and just really appreciating the care and thought in this space. I'm going to bring us now to the driving question of this panel: can our institutions change? Alan mentioned working in the child welfare reform movement, and I do want to distinguish between the kind of change that we would, I think, in this panel deem reformatory change or reform, and radical change to our institutions, structures, and logics. And I think the concept of carceral entanglements is really, that's a nice phrase that you use, Charles, because I think as academics, when we're studying the thing, sometimes that means we're in the thing, and then Wells Fargo wants to help you keep studying it, and you have to decide what to do about that. So, yeah, so thinking about how the ways in which we're entangled and the ways in which we're also fugitives, what does radical change to these institutions look like? And maybe more concretely, what strategies and tactics do you all see that are productive towards radical change?
I can start this one. So the short answer to your question is, can our institutions change, is no. Because I think the difference that I've realized over the years when we think of the child welfare system between people who believe it can be reformed and people who believe it needs to be abolished is our understanding of the history of the system. If you believe that the system is fundamentally doing good and just needs to work out the kinks that it has, like work out the things that are not working well, then you might think that reform is possible. But if you understand that the system was created in the years just post-abolition of slavery for the explicit purpose of maintaining oppression of formerly enslaved people, and that at its core, it operates or undergirded by racism and white supremacy and a need to maintain a system of racial capitalism that was really threatened when slavery was abolished. So the child welfare system, many of our government systems were designed for the explicit purpose of maintaining an exploitable labor class for the purpose of capitalist accumulation of the white elites who control society. Once you understand these systems as being that, then you know that you can't just reform that away, that destroying those systems and recreating them is the only solution. I said I spent many years as a reformer and then not really understanding why those reforms weren't working. And I came to understand reforms don't work because they're just a trick. Reforms are a trick that white people want you to think that you're doing something to make a change, to make a system better. So when the child welfare system is under fire for something, they come up with a reform, and then they tout that reform, and that pacifies sometimes the public, sometimes it pacifies the legislators who are giving them heat. All the while, the child welfare system knows that reform is not going to ultimately do anything, because the reforms tinker a little bit, they make system improvements without ever trying to address the fundamental harm of the system, which is forcible family separation. The reforms never address that. So you do all these reforms, but meanwhile, children are being forcibly separated from their parents, up to upwards of 200, 300,000 children a year that are separated from their parents. So they're never going to work, and the system knows they're not going to work, but they fool people into thinking that they're doing something. If you think right now, the system's big reform effort is around racial equity, and the Federal Commissioner of Child Protective Services talks about racial equity everywhere she goes, and that sounds really good, right? Like, who wouldn't want racial equity in the child welfare system or in any system? But think about what racial equity really means. If this problem in the system is that we have this disproportionate representation of black children, then the solution is proportional representation, which is equity. But what does that mean? That still means that hundreds of thousands of black children are separated, or hundreds of thousands of children are separated from their parents. They're just proportioned equitably by their skin color. Equitable harm is still harm. Prison abolitionists often say, nicer, friendlier cages are still cages. And that's the same that we can apply to foster care and family separations. It's just a trick. So understanding, I think, the idea, and I think this is important for social workers or anyone who works in these systems, we've been told for many years that we can create change from the inside. And that's why social workers go to work in these systems. Social workers go to work with the police, they go to work in prisons, they go to work for ICE, they go to work for involuntary commitment institutions. Change from the inside is a trick too. Change from the inside is something that the white people who control those institutions want us to believe, so we continue to work in those institutions. It's not going to work because those systems don't want to change. So when it comes to social work, I think we have to get to the place where we say, we tried to create change for decades from the inside. We gave it a valiant effort. It didn't work. And now we need to do something differently. And that's okay. Just saying that we failed at our attempts is okay. The system didn't want to change, and despite how much we wanted it to change, it didn't work. So we, social workers, other people working in these institutions, need to work from the outside to bring about change. And that really does mean abolition. We talk about recreation of systems a lot. I think the child welfare system needs to be recreated. I think institutions of higher education, institutions of education generally, banking need to be recreated. But recreation means that the thing that existed before needs to be destroyed, and then you recreate something different.
And I think that one of the things that you just sort of laid out is the strategy first has to be disentanglement. And so I'm curious, I'm curious to sort of get into and you've all touched on this a little bit, what disentangling looks like from institutions, and in order to you're right, not change, but eliminate what's there to and build something different.
So I think, I don't know, the point of the disentanglement is kind of like tricky, right? Because disentanglement is sort of like but one part of that equation. And to be sure, I need to like give Jada Pinkett Smith her flowers, because this is like where I started with the entanglement thing, as I think some of us did. And I was like, oh yeah, girl, there's so many like things that we are entangled in, right? That like need remediation and to be addressed, and spurn, people that we love. So let me like muse on that. So amazing philosopher and theorist Jada Pinkett Smith in the Red Table. But when I think about the ways that like abolition, so I talked about abolition within versus abolition of, right? I think we have to take ownership of the things over which we have dominion, given our different positions within the academy, right? And so like there's very few, although many people within the academy have fewer levels of autonomy, that like even faculty, tenured or otherwise, really have that you can like dictate and control. The classroom is one of those things, right? And so if I desire for us as a community of teachers and learners to engage in an abolitionist exercise, then part of it is like relieving ourselves of all of the expectation of what it means to be a teacher and a student, and like who occupies that role at what time, and the way that we share responsibility for what it is that we're going to do in a particular class that may or may not go along with this like social contract of the syllabus. Like my syllabus is a pretty laughable document altogether, because it's like very aspirational, as I'm sure a lot of them are, and every single year we just start kicking stuff off the syllabus, and inevitably like the final paper just is not going to happen. It's very optional at that point. And part of that's dealing with like the overall exhaustion that many students feel based on the various presses, right, at the time. But I'm also challenged by this idea of that if students find comfort in a classroom we've co-created, in part because they don't have it anywhere else, then how does the thing that seems most important intellectually and personally become the thing to which we are least invested in preserving, because it has to hold all of the weight of everything else that has happened? But again, if I'm thinking about actually dealing with and contending with repairing and restoring from harm and violence, I have to account for the harm and violence that occurs outside of the classroom, that when students come in, you can visibly like see, right, the weight of what folks are holding. And you're like, you know what, we're not gonna get shit done today. So what do y'all wanna talk about? And let's get into that. So I think about abolition on like that sort of smaller within scale, right? Of like, let's abolish and reimagine then what teaching and learning can look like in this 2 hours and 50 minutes that they give us technically. I always go like 2:55 and 3, and the person after me is really upset. I'm like, but this is my time. But like, how do we abolish, right, that sort of notion? How do we abolish the role of student in this, right? Don't ask me what it means to like get an A in this class, right? Because like, I want to know what it is you want to learn and whether we can achieve that. Because if you've already had engagement with the content, you'll do very well just by virtue of having engaged with the content. Does that mean you learned anything? Or did you perform well, the things that you already knew? So I think there's those sort of like types of abolitionist moments that happen through acts of fugitivity, acts of insurgency that are important. Same thing with the research team. But I think also the ways that we can come to the defense of, not save, but come to the defense of folks who are differently vulnerable, right, in these moments, and advocate tooth and nail for ensuring that they don't experience a typical type of harm and violence. So I know that this institution, like many research institutions, has a particular way of pushing people out, right, and pushing specifically Black graduate students out from many programs, some of whom find their way to my office before they get pushed out, and we got to push back together. Now that creates a certain taxation and burden, which the literature discusses and talks about. But again, like, who are we answerable to, right? I know that, and probably one of the greatest testaments to anything that I've been able to do as a professor is when I'm able to graduate a Black graduate student, and they mama, because it's always they mama, occasionally it's the daddy, but usually you just give me like a nod or something. But it's the mama that says, thank you for taking care of my baby. And I have to remind them and thank them for letting their baby take care of me. And I say that because the retention process is always thought about in a way that isn't about how we retain one another in this space. I'll use Irene as a great example, who, like, we've been few and far between for the years we've both been in this ecosystem, but yet, you know, a DM will happen here and a check-in will happen there, and we'll know kind of what's been going on, and we'll say like, yo, heard some stuff, you okay, like, what is it? Because we know politically we have an alignment that is probably missed by these role definitions, right? And so that becomes in a certain type of intimate engagement and practice, and where we can abolish the rules of engagement that we've been socialized into, of like what faculty do and don't do, what students do and don't do, who is responsible for whom, to whom you go when you experience these types of things, right? I entrust in my graduate students all the time, like the stuff that I be going through that they also go through, just so we know that we're kind of in the same space. And I think about that as a really important site. And why I say that is because we can like think grandiosely, as we should, about how abolition functions in these like institutions and in societies. But what I found to be true is a lot of folks who are also in this space don't practice abolition in their everyday relations, right? So like the greatest, I think, challenge I have, at least at present, of like whether I can be an abolitionist, is that I've got a 9-month-old and a 4-year-old. And I hadn't even thought about what it meant to be an abolitionist parent, whatever that is, right? But then I think about those, right? The exercises of confinement, right? The implements of social control. And my kids' names are freedom and justice. So like, I'm not getting out of any of this lightly, right? But I'm like, no, every day they test my politics, as does my partner, right? Like, are you gonna be who you say you're going to be? And it's the thing I think I love about her the most, is that it's not even like her doing anything necessarily intentionally all the time. I mean, sometimes she'll poke and prod just for shits and giggles, but like just being who she is makes me accountable to a thing that I say that I am about in a way that is really the only thing that matters, right? I can like give this lecture, do this lab, do whatever. Folks treat you find out you treat your family like trash, like none of that actually matters, right? Because you're masquerading, you're performing. And so I know that the first test of my abolitionism is gonna be like when it's time to go to school and the 4-year-old's like, I'm not wearing this outfit. And I'm like, you picked it out. I'm not wearing it. Okay, like what's the next thing? Or knowing I need to take an exit, my partner's gotta go in and triage the situation, we gotta do breathing exercises, which for a 4-year-old, she's very advanced at, right? And then we have to like blow kisses at the door when I'm gonna leave and like go about our day and have a good day. And so if that's my starting point, then like the rest of everything else seems relatively easy, right? Because I have that memory, right? I have that experience of thinking that like all of these harms, I wouldn't say all of them are reparable, but many of them like are. But I think what's important to think about institutions is that we not hold space for redeemability. And this is the thing that we're contending with a lot in our lab. We build on Baldwin's sort of articulation, which Eddie Glaude picks up in his book Begin Again, of like whether America, or the idea of America itself, is redeemable. And we're applying that to the context of white serving institutions. And I've long been sort of musing about, and I'm thankful for graduate students helping me think through this, is that like the neoliberal university itself, the white serving institution, is not a redeemable place, right? Like in the same way whiteness itself as an ideological construct, a way of being an embodiment, is not redeemable. So then what do we do with that, right? And to be sure, like I don't have those answers, nor do I think abolitionists should be charged with them, in the finding those answers, but that we are committed to a process of figuring out a thing that if it's not redeemable, like many other things we do away with, right? We find something else to do within its place. And I think what's important about knowing about redeemability is one thing, but like repatriation and redistribution are also others. So if we're gonna get rid of the university as we know it, there's a lot of nice shit in here that can go somewhere else, right? There's a lot of food that's getting wasted at a place that still has food insecurity, right? Or communities that don't have access to that. There's a lot of real estate that we could like relieve ourselves of that could make way for, free housing, right? There's tuition that we actually don't have to charge. And so I think about then what does a politic of redistribution and repatriation mean if we're serious about whatever this land acknowledgement is supposed to be, of giving the land to its original caretakers, right? Of redistributing the immense amount of resources and wealth that are hoarded, right? And then denied to folks like Ansa, the USC student who was supposed to be giving her valedictorian speech, and that for safety reasons, we all of a sudden can't let her have the speech. So I'm like, you have one of the most robust safety and security apparatuses in all of, collegiate America, but you can't figure this one out, right? So I think that's part of what we have to think about in terms of like what we do is the survival pending revolution, right? Like what do we do with the things we have until we can move to the things that we need?
I'm actually gonna take over here so that we can have some time for questions from folks in the audience. We're gonna start with a couple questions from folks here in person, and we do have a lot of people online. What's our number online? I don't know if you. About 90 folks listening online. So
Are you thinking this was intimate the whole time?
yeah. So we meant to tell you, but we didn't get the number fast enough. And so we do want to create some space for the online folks to ask some questions as well. So gonna swap. And yeah.
Hi, this is Kate Myers. Thank you guys so much for being here. I am an MSW here, and I hope to be a social worker in a school environment. So my question for you is kind of a two-parter. First, acknowledging that we're nowhere close to our dream as abolitionists as far as dismantling these institutions, what strategies can we employ in classrooms as social workers now that will help us reach that long-term goal? And also, what would schools look like once we reach that goal completely? And then the second part is, how do we uphold and honor abolition praxis while being mandated reporters as social workers and educators?
I think when we're thinking about social workers in schools, I think an important thing to think through is how you're going to relate to students in a way that doesn't involve any kind of punishment or punitive aspect. And the reason I'm thinking of this is because a friend just shared an article with me that some of you may be familiar with because it came out about 10 years ago. It's called Give the Kid a Pencil. And it's about, it just like blew my mind when I read it. It's like half a page long, but it's this idea about an educator who went to a group of, or a trainer of educators who went to another group of educators and gave a scenario about a child, probably like early elementary school, who kept coming to class without a pencil every day and asked these teachers what they would do. And the teachers brainstormed for a while and came up with all of these things. Oh, we'll put him on some kind of action plan. We'll talk to his mom, or we'll send him home every day with a reminder to bring a pencil. But everything involves some kind of punitive response, or it was always like a disciplinary action plan, something to do to fix the child's behavior. And the trainer said, why don't you just give him a pencil? And that seemed like so simple. And they said, well, if we give him a pencil one time, what if he wants a pencil every day? And the trainer said, there's literally a limitless supply of pencils in the world. You could have a bake sale and fundraise for pencils. You could go buy some yourself. You could ask your neighbors to chip in for pencils. Just give him a pencil. And then they were still, well, he's going to eventually start to take advantage of us. And there may be that one case out of thousands where a child takes advantage of all the free pencils that he's getting, but that's probably not the norm. But I think we all start with this very punitive response. If the rule is you bring a pencil every day and you don't, then we have to implement some kind of punishment. Just give the kid a pencil. And I think that applies to so many aspects beyond the classroom. Mandatory reporting, I think, is a complicated issue in the sense that I'll answer it from a macro perspective first. I think that all social workers should be involved in efforts to repeal mandatory reporting laws because of the harm that we know that they cause. In the interim of fully repealing mandatory reporting laws, we should be advocating for legislation that scales back mandatory reporting. In some states, they're passing laws that essentially provide a waiver to mandatory reporting if a person can document another way that they provided help to a child. Joyce McMillan, who's a kind of well-known family policing activist in New York City, calls that mandatory supporting, meaning that we should all have a responsibility to support a child who's in need without having a responsibility to report to this harmful hotline. But I think we also need to educate ourselves about what mandatory reporting laws really say. Mandatory reporting laws are written very vaguely on purpose, but most mandatory reporting laws, even though they differ by state, generally say that people need to make a report when there's a reasonable suspicion of imminent harm. And I think in many cases people make reports to those hotlines when that threshold isn't met, because we don't really understand the system, and we think that if a child comes to school hungry, if a child comes to school with dirty clothes, or they haven't slept all night, if we call the hotline, they'll get help. we need, and many people believe that. So if you're a person who understands that that's not the case, then I would ask you to educate all the people that you're around in that school setting to know that that's not the case. Calling a hotline is never a neutral decision, and it's never a benevolent decision. It will always cause harm every time. There are, because of laws, I can't tell you to just not do it, but I would tell you to really understand alternatives to mandatory reporting in ways that really do provide help that the system will never provide.
Hello, I have a question that is something I've been thinking about a lot recently and might be a bit subjective and look different for everybody. But I've been thinking a lot about the complicity that comes with working within the system and how can you not? And any field is going to be complicit within it. Even if I were to pack my bags and leave America, any grocery store I go to sends money to genocide. Anything that I do is going to inherently be tied to it. So I guess my question is there a good ratio of how much time I should be spending trying to work within this system and also work outside of it and try to make change like that? You know, there's, I think, power in trying to be a change agent within these institutions and within our systems and tending to the garden where I can reach it. And so one being this institution or my career, my internship. These are all places that have stake in the game, but it's also like not going to lead us to liberation is these systems. So do I spend more time outside, more time inside? So I know it can look different for everybody, but I'm curious as to what your guys' thoughts are.
Well, I'll say, I mean, as Charles was saying earlier, I mean, a lot of your work takes place in higher education. We all are academics working in higher education that share, I think, the concerns, about the challenges, the oppressions that institutions of higher education, right, perpetuate. And we are all here kind of employed by them doing that work. And so for me, I would say that these are tensions that I experience. I mean, I think we experience them in different ways. And like for myself, I want to be able to go home at the end of the day and like not feel like I had done something like pretty terrible and awful. And I think that is like a thing that like each individual person has to figure out, sort of the lines and the boundaries of the work for themselves in some way, and push kind of for change where we can, and in sort of the scopes of our influences. But I want to bring in Joy James has work on academic abolition, like academics' sort of perceptions of abolition, and I'm probably going to misstate it a little bit here. She's a scholar and writer, writes on abolition, and that one of the critiques that she makes is that if academics are being more read and doing the theorizing around abolition than writers who are incarcerated or people who have been directly impacted, what sorts of ways are we as academics perhaps like sanitizing the radicalism that is embedded within abolition? And so I'm saying this to say that, I think that there are probably other folks that we could look to for theorizing, what being within a system, looks like, and how they to work and navigate some of those tensions that are written about by incarcerated writers and folks who are directly impacted.
So I'll just pick up on that very briefly. 2 points. So Mark Lamont Hill gave the social justice lecture at the American Education Research Association last week. And part of what he discussed was about his relationship with Mumia Abu-Jamal, who's one of the longest standing political prisoners that we have in the country. And he remembers when they were able to make a win of getting Mumia off of death row, and how there were certain like purists that were saying like, this is not a victory, it's actually doing more harm. And he's like, if you just ask Mumia, he's going to say like, there's absolutely a victory because these people have never been on death row, right? So I think that's sort of like one aspect of it. But I think also pushing against this like puritanical aspiration of like a political sort of self that says that there aren't going to be contradictions, right? And so picking up on the Joy James piece, I would say perhaps worry less about where you spend your time doing what the work is and more about where do you invest in relationship. And so she talks deeply about this. She has a piece with her and Edmund T. Gordon in a book called Engaging Contradictions by Charles Hale. It's a compendium, and at the end of it, she talks about where academics can and should find community, but she talks partly in that the academic itself can only be thought of as radical and never be thought of as revolutionary by virtue of our unwillingness to divest ourselves from the reward structures that academia provides, which is a point I will gladly concede, right? Like health insurance, check, whatever. And she would put herself in that too. But what she does say is that for many of our colleagues, and white colleagues in particular, right, they often feel like an attack on academia is an attack on them because all of their identities are wrapped up in their entire set of relations with this, right? All their best friends are here. It's their longest standing professional gig, whatever the case may be. And she says often that, as I sort of articulated before, if you don't have relationship outside of the academy, right, and you let this place like accumulate and acquire your identity around it, then you get thrust into these spaces of doing this like burdened labor, right? Which is always the case, right? You bring up a problem to the institution, they say, great, fix it. And then they put you on a committee or a task force or something else. So I would say, think more about how do you apportion your relationships that allow for this to just be the job, right? Because academia is really good at alluring us to think that you can get your work done here, and a lot of it you can't. And know that it's just a job and treat it as such, because they definitely treat you just as an employee, right? So where is your work going to be and where are your relations going to be? And I would argue that they must be mostly outside of the academy.
And I think I'm going to add quickly to that is like, it's okay to want like stable, good housing and health care and like retirement. And we also want everybody to have those things, things that everybody kind of deserves automatically too.
Okay, an online question, and I think a lot of the questions that came online kind of like were subsumed in these questions, but one person touched on time and this work, and so just kind of like maybe closing, like we think about the histories of abolition and like how we tap into those histories, and thinking about imaginary, like our imaginaries of like abolition, like what's the possibilities, and like how do we stay present to like now and also like respect kind of and honor like our histories and our futures, and like how do you all see kind of like thinking about time in this abolition work?
That's something that I wrote about in my book a lot, in the sense that I think for me it was important to come to the understanding that the abolition movement today is the same abolition movement that started during slavery. And there's a lot of readings that you can all read to see those connections, in the sense that what I came to understand about the abolition movement during the era of chattel slavery is that the goal of that abolition was not to abolish slavery. Abolishing slavery was a necessary precondition for the actual goal, but the goal was liberation of formerly enslaved people. And that liberation has never happened. So today, the systems that we need to end, the institutions are different, but the goal of that abolition movement is the same. So we're honoring the past by keeping the dream for what abolition really is about alive and doing the work we're doing today.
I would just add that part of any political struggle is a deep commitment to imagine and remake a world in which you may not yourself live, right? And I think that becomes so important, especially because of like the burnout, right, and the emotional taxation and the nihilism that is a consequence of not seeing things move at a certain moment. But again, like when we think about this through sort of like the radical imagination lens and the freedom dreams that Robin G.D. Kelley sort of articulates, right, when we feel it impossible or unlikely even that we will benefit in a certain way from the things for which we're fighting, we have to understand like we exist in someone else's radical imagination at present, right? Like somebody radically imagined a version of us in captivity, somebody radically imagined us existing in fugitivity. And so if for not for nothing, we know these things can come about and will come about. But again, as I sort of attested to earlier, like I'm living in an abolished version of a world that like my great grandmother never saw come to pass, right? As far as I know, I think I'm the only person on either side of my family to have a doctorate for a woman who like didn't even get to finish grade school, right? And if we want to accept that, like, I am my ancestors' wildest dreams, maybe it fits in there. I mean, that's contested, but right, we can put it there. So I think that becomes a thing about time. To Alan's point, is like, we are but a marker on a long history of struggle. And there are things that we are fighting for today from which future generations will benefit, that I hope my children will benefit from, right? But I hope that they feel compelled to continue fighting for a liberated future that their children will then benefit from. Because I don't think that we're entrusted caretakers of a time in which we currently exist. I don't think time makes sense in that way to me. It used to, but that became very like selfish and individualistic, and sort of navel gazing in a way that, like, if it's only about me and I don't get the things I want, this is how you see people separate from political engagement, right? Like, well, what are you actually fighting for? Right? I can't be fighting for things that just benefit me, because so many other folks will be still held in captivity, Black women especially, right? So I think we just have to broaden our conception of like where we are within this like continuum of time, right? This decolonization of time as these like three dimensions that aren't working together all at once, that will help us understand sort of where we are within this long struggle.
Yeah, and I'll just add that, I mean, I hope that, right, I can make small contributions to the places where I'm working and the people that I'm connected with, that somebody else, like after me in a different space, will go far beyond what I could have imagined myself, right? That they will be able to like build and create and envision new things that, you know, where I was, you know, not able to be imaginative or creative in a sort of way that just, what I was able to do offers something for them to take, like, even farther.
Okay, I think we'll end there. Thank you so much. And I love that idea, like someone imagined us. And I think like think about like the everyday relationships and like this relationality of like, that also helps. Every like moment of a relationality helps you imagine what's also possible. So I'm taking that with me. So yeah, thank you all for joining. Also, just want to like say another thank you to the Luke family for being here, Michael and Allie who are here, and also Ginger who's online. So thank you so much. And then we have some more books in the back, so if you are interested, we have Ellen's book, and there's food, so for those who are here, please stay around a little bit and let's keep talking. So thank you all.